Hello, everyone. This is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for continued support. Before getting into today's video, I wanted to talk a little bit about channel logistics. I want to make a push for growth this year. I want to try and make this channel into something I can sustain over a long term. For my part, that means I'm going to try and post content as regularly as I can. This means I'll do my preferred style of video, these long form 40+ minute videos, at least bi-weekly, if not more frequently. These tend to be really high effort, so I cannot promise that they'll come weekly. For your part, I would appreciate if you could like these videos and share them, and if you could subscribe and press the notifications button. All of these metrics really help. They help YouTube know that you want to watch my videos. They help my videos get to the people whom they need to get to. And of course, one of the biggest ways you can help is joining a channel membership. It is a small monthly fee to directly support me, and of course, you get some perks out of it, like early access to my videos, or in some cases, written build guides accompanying some of those videos that I've been releasing. That being said, even if you cannot join a channel membership, any form of support you can give is appreciated. Every little bit helps this channel grow and helps me keep making content. Now let's get to the video. Today's topic is a little different than a lot of my player-facing optimization content. It can be used as optimization advice though, but broadly today I'm going to be talking about encounter building guidelines, or specifically about some things that I see said about the encounter building guidelines that I just don't think are true. The encounter guidelines are seen as this rigid, fragile thing that you must adhere to by the online community, and that's just not been my experience. I've been GMing for about 2.5 years now, and I bend and break a whole bunch of things that many of y'all view as hard and fast rules. So I wanted to try and figure out where this disagreement is happening. Where am I seeing things differently than many of you all do? And that is what led to this video, the biggest myths you will encounter online about encounters. Now, the interesting thing is that all of the myths I'm going to talk about in this video trace their origin back to one singular myth that sort of has multiple facets to it. The idea that Pathfinder is inherently a combat as sport game, and it does not and cannot support combat as war. Now, to some extent, this is a false dichotomy. Combat as sport and combat as war are gameplay styles. They're not inherent to a game. You can play an OSR game as combat as sport if you want to. You can play Pathfinder as combat as war. That being said, signposting and support is a real thing, and I hope over the course of the rest of this video, I convince you that Pathfinder actually does support combat as war. You can, of course, play it combat as sport, but you can also play it combat as war. Some of you are probably unfamiliar with these terms. Let me explain them. Combat as sport essentially means that encounters are biased towards the player. They're fair in the sense that the players need to be facing, 30, 40 encounters over the course of an adventure and have a really good shot at coming out alive at the other end of it, and doing so in a pretty straightforward manner. So if an encounter exists, you're supposed to be able to win the vast majority of them just via straightforward combat, using what's on your character sheet. And in fact, you don't even necessarily have to worry about how encounters may relate to one another. If you're facing an encounter that is 1 of 8, the expectation is that the GM has balanced the adventuring day around you, and most of them are low or trivial threat. If you're facing an extreme threat encounter, the expectation is it's the only one of the day. That is essentially what combat as sport gameplay looks like, and many Pathfinder players will probably just think that is how the game runs, because that is sort of the online consensus on how the game runs. And combat as war is the spiritual inverse of this. Encounters are not even necessarily individually winnable, let alone over the course of an adventuring day. Every encounter expects you to pull out all the stops if it's deadly. You may have to play dirty by pre-buffing or setting up traps, and the NPCs might also play dirty. And in fact, you will probably regularly have encounters where you're in over your heads. Either this encounter is individually just way too tough for you, or it would have been easy on full resources, but you're running on fumes. And the expectation is that you must find your way around these problems. And like I said, Pathfinder does support this gameplay style. I GM my games this way. I even GM adventure paths this way, and it works great. Now, a very common refrain to Pathfinder supporting combat as war is the idea that you cannot put an enemy that's more than 4 or 5 levels above the party in front of them. It'll just immediately kill them. To that, I say just be a better GM. Like, what are we talking about here? Impossible challenges exist in every game. You could say the same for an old school Renaissance game. OSR games are built to support combat as war, and there's still going to be challenges that are impossible for the party. You don't take an impossible challenge, put it in a white room, put the players in a linear path to that white room, and then call it war when they inevitably die in the encounter that ensues. That's not combat as war. That's rocks fall, everyone dies. Real combat as war isn't impossible challenges. It is a wide variety of challenges. Some of them where the party will feel in over their heads, some of them the party can manage, and the idea is that there's several combinations of paths that clever players who engage with the game and pay attention are able to get through them and ultimately win. So I always found this refrain outright nonsensical. I don't think it makes the slightest bit of sense because that's just not how any tabletop role-playing game runs. But there are many, many, many other concerns about Pathfinder's support of combat as war, and they're much more valid because many of them, superficially at least, appear to be embedded into the game's assumptions, and the online consensus is that they are indeed embedded in the game's assumptions. So let's deconstruct them one by one. Now, a very important disclaimer. There is nothing wrong with simply enjoying combat as sport. Anyone who says there's something wrong with that is gatekeeping. Point and laugh at the gatekeepers for me. Do not say people are somehow less skilled at the game than you, or GMs are running less realistic games just because they're running combat as sport. Some players are simply not interested in this gameplay. This gameplay is very strategy heavy, which is different than tactics. It's more about what you bring into the dungeon in terms of items and scrolls and how you scout ahead and how you sequence various encounters. And it's not interesting to a lot of players to do that. And if they don't want to engage in it, they don't want to engage in it. And similarly, some GMs might just prefer the simplicity of doing things a little by the book. GMing is hard, so simply following as close to the reference points in the game's guidelines and rarely deviating from them is fine if it makes the GM's life easier, especially because running proper combat as war is a lot of effort on the GM's part. So do not say there's anything wrong with combat as sport. The only thing wrong here is the idea that it's the default, that it's the expectation, or in the most extreme arguments I've seen, that it's mandatorily enforced by Pathfinder's rules. In particularly bad cases, I have seen folks call others bad GMs for disagreeing with this idea, for not running the game combat as sport. I have been called a bad GM in multiple conversations because I simply did not stick to these rigid assumptions, and that's not okay. The other problem of this expectation is that a lot of folks give advice for what they consider optimal based on these rigid assumptions. They then present that advice as universally applicable and just always the one true optimal way of playing, and then ridicule you if you say that that's not true and that hasn't been true at your tables. They just call you a bad player for not agreeing with their silly takes on what's optimal. That, again, not okay. And finally, these assumptions are used as central pillars of criticizing designs. You will see this all the time. You'll see people say spellcasters in Pathfinder are poorly designed because Pathfinder is designed to be a zero attrition game. If half the damn classes in the game have attrition, it was never designed to be a zero attrition game. You just made an assumption that worked for your table, and then you're criticizing the game's design for an assumption it never tried to stick to. This is particularly harmful when it's used to dismiss third-party content creators. I've seen these arguments levied against third-party content creators where someone will come up with something and then a bunch of people who have these rigid assumptions about how the game should play will say, well, that's never going to come up. That's never going to come up at your table. That doesn't mean the book was aimed at you. Other people might have it come up. Let them have fun with it. So those are the problems I'm hoping to address with this video. The goal is not to say that you can't or shouldn't play combat as sport. It's that if you like combat as war, Pathfinder does indeed support it, and a lot of the things the online community says are expectations aren't expectations. So here is how you take the advice. If you are a GM, you can use everything I say in this video to spice up your gameplay if you want to, if you think you can afford to put in the effort. And if you're a player, you can use this to prepare for the kinds of nonsense your GM might want to do to you. And finally, remember, myths never come from a vacuum. Every single myth has a grain of truth at its center, and every myth in this video is going to be addressed with that grain of truth. So that was a crazy long preamble. Let's get into it. So here's myth number 1. The game expects a rest after every combat. That is to say, the game expects you to start at full HP and full focus points and have had a chance to restore cooldowns on 1 minute or 10-minute long abilities every single combat. And of course, conveniently, it doesn't seem to think so about spell slots because that is never a part of the myth. People are okay with spell slots depleting. The grain of truth here is that the game presents you encounter guidelines with a full resource party as its reference point. So when they say something is moderate threat, they mean it is moderately threatening to a full resource party. But the idea that you always need to be at this reference point is inherently flawed. Why would you need to be there for every single combat? The encounter guidelines certainly don't say so. They use it as a reference. Something being your reference doesn't mean that it's always going to be true. And in fact, the folks saying that you need to stick to these encounter guidelines tightly are usually the biggest proponents of the idea that the game's math is generally tight. Well, if it's tight, why do you also think it's so fragile that you cannot be a few HP under your maximum or 1 focus point below your maximum when a moderate threat encounter starts? Why would that be the case? How is it both tight and fragile? Which is it? Funnily enough, the game has many guidelines that explicitly contradict this myth. The first is actually just embedded into the assumption. I talked about how HP and focus points are covered here, but oddly enough, spell slots are not. But the game doesn't differentiate them that way. The encounter guidelines just say resources. The one and only encounter threat level that says that it's a good idea for the party to be fully rested, that is, have most or all of their spell slots available, is extreme threat, which is designed to be an even match for the party. Anything under extreme threat, if you read the guidelines, it just says resources. It makes no attempt to distinguish between a resource that would have come back in 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour, or 8 hours. This differentiation is purely the construct of online discourse. The game does not differentiate it that way. Then there's the fact that multiple guidelines in the book explicitly reference being at less than full resources, again, including things that are not spell slots, when you face them. The section on moderate threat encounters explicitly says that good tactics are needed to progress without resting. Why would it mention that if it expected you to never do that? Likewise, the section on combining and separating encounters explicitly says that it'd be pretty damn unrealistic to just beat an encounter and then stay there resting with nothing in the rest of the area changing to react to you, especially if the area has people who heard that encounter or are allied with the people you just killed or captured. So really, there is nowhere in the game where it says that it expects you to be at full HP and full focus points for every single combat. It actually makes no attempt to distinguish spell slots from these two resources, so it is really weird that people are okay with spell slots being a little low but never the former too, and the game actually explicitly says that this is not the case in many different places. In reality, all that happens is when you're low on resources, things get incrementally tougher. They don't just fall apart. Low feels moderate. Moderate feels severe. Severe feels extreme or sometimes more lethal than extreme. And extreme is the one and only encounter difficulty that explicitly and near universally needs full or near full resources. And the guidelines tell you that. It's the only single encounter guideline to mention a full night's rest in the text. Otherwise, the game just expects you to take things in stride as needed. Sometimes you will rest before moderate encounters, sometimes you won't, and you'll just kind of have to deal with it. The game also makes no attempt to codify how much tougher things get, because it can't. And I have seen the argument that because the game does not codify how many encounters a party can take that are easier than severe, they're expected to have a full rest before every encounter. Otherwise, it would have codified it the way, say, D&D 5th edition does with its guidelines and adventuring XP budgets, right? I don't think that makes much sense. It's not trying to codify this. Inherently, because it wants to support a combat as war philosophy, it shouldn't codify these things. It's not trying to tell the GM, hey, run this many encounters. If you run too few, things will get too easy. If you run too many, the party will fall apart. There are other games that try to do that. Drawsteel, for example, has a very rigid progression on when you can use certain encounter difficulties. The most difficult encounters are unwinnable at the beginning of the day and pretty easy at the end of the day. But Pathfinder isn't trying to codify that and shouldn't be trying to codify that. It is trying to support combat as war and explicitly tells you in many, many different places that while these guidelines use a full resource party as a reference point, you're not going to be at full resources all the time. Otherwise, why would they even have resources? And speaking of why would we even have resources if you weren't intended to use them, that brings me to the second myth I wanted to talk about. The idea that resource management isn't part of the game, that it's not incorporated into the game's math or balance, and that the game was trying to do away with attrition as a whole. This is an idea I see mentioned a lot in online discourse, this idea that Pathfinder 2nd edition is just moving away from attrition as a whole, and that's just not a design consideration anymore. And naturally, it is related to Myth 1. But as you'll dig into it, you'll realize it's sort of related in a circular way. People assume that HP and focus points are always at their maximum when a combat starts, therefore resource management isn't part of the game, and because resource management isn't part of the game, you should always be in max HP and focus points. It's a very circular argument. Now here is the grain of truth at the center. The game does not expect GMs to carefully craft an adventuring day for the party. The party is not expected to be handheld through a specific number of encounters, and there is no expectation that if you go under this, the party will, say, overperform, and if you go over this, the party will TPK. For example, in 5th edition D&D, where you're supposed to fill out an adventuring day's worth of XP budget, and if you undershoot too much, spellcasters will really overperform, and if you overshoot even a little, the party will almost certainly TPK unless they're extremely optimized to these challenges. That isn't an expectation in Pathfinder's design guidelines. Pathfinder gives GMs guidelines to have 1 encounter days, 12 encounter days, anything in between, if they want to cater challenges to the party, and then it also just leaves them the option of not catering the challenges and instead letting the party dictate their own resource expenditure. You will notice in the combat threat guidelines that a lot of the threats make no mention of the GM catering to the party's resources. They make mention of what actions the party take based on the resource expenditure they have encountered so far. And the funny thing is, this myth isn't even really internally consistent. Like, if you looked at the first myth, the idea of HP and focus points being at full, one could see that as being a consistent point in a vacuum. But then when you look at the combat threat guidelines, you realize, oh no, the book contradicts it. This myth contradicts itself. Because at its baseline, it is based on the premise that resource management isn't part of the game except daily activations. Because there's no way around the fact that spell slots do deplete over the course of a day. But you don't just get to say except daily activations. Of the 27 classes in the game, what, there's 10, 12 that have spell slots? You can't treat nearly half of the game's classes as an exception. The very idea that resource management isn't accounted for in the game relies on this very strange assumption that HP and focus points are the only relevant resources, and that daily activations are just this bonus on top. But that's not how the game is designed. Spell slots are incorporated into the game's balance. And it's not just spell slots. There are other things that deplete over the course of days too. Firstly, marshals can just have once per day abilities. A guardian that has access to Tough Cookie is very different than a guardian that doesn't have access to Tough Cookie. There's also item activations, which marshals might rely on. A melee character might have a once per day option to fly or climb a wall much more effectively. They might have a once per day activation like the Monk Sash of Prowess that lets them upgrade the outcome of their grapples. There are a ton of once per day activations that marshals end up using, and these are a pretty important part of engaging with the game. And once they start depleting, the marshals are being attritioned too, even if they're not being attritioned as much as spell slots are. And consumables are a big part of this too. I'm not saying every party needs to play with the somewhat cheesy consumable meta of always knowing what mutagens and elixirs to use, but the truth is that marshals who are using these consumables are punching above their weight in the same way that spell slots let you. A melee tank using numbing or soothing tonic to improve their longevity is gonna do better than one who doesn't have a numbing or soothing tonic, and those run out. Someone using a useful talisman like the Emerald Grasshopper that lets you leap a really long distance, having that talisman and then running out of those is attrition. So attrition is a pretty meaningful part of the game. It affects spellcasters the most, and those can't be treated as an exception. That's half the game. And then it also affects marshals via item activations, once per day abilities that they pick via their own feats, and consumables, which are often key to a marshal engaging with things that otherwise they'd be relying on a spellcaster to help them engage with. And there's a second aspect to it. We're only talking about daily attrition so far, things that run out over the course of a day or multiple days. Some of them come back the next day, like these daily activations, item activations, and spell slots, and others are just permanently gone forever, like consumables, which you have to then go back to town to buy. But there are other forms of attrition too. Time is, in fact, a resource. Once per minute options, they can be taxed by chain encounters. For example, if you had 2 encounters that were separate, you take care of the first one, you get to wait some time before the second one, versus you fight the first one, the second one joins in. You have now attrition the once per minute resources. Once per 10-minute resources can be taxed via roaming encounters or counterattacks. You beat the first encounter, you start resting, and then the second encounter attacks you while you're resting. You didn't tax any of your once per minute resources, but you did end up taxing once per 10-minute resources. And once per hour resources just end up getting taxed pretty naturally. Something like a Psychic's Strained Mind or a Greater Boots of Free Running with its once per hour climbing activation, they will just get taxed naturally if you're tracking time at all, really. And notably, anything that's lower on the list can also be taxed by anything above it. So once per 10 minutes can also be taxed by chained encounters. Once per hour abilities can be taxed by anything that taxes both a once per minute ability or a once per 10 minutes ability. So there's just a lot of different time pressures that tax various ability activations. And again, you just have to ignore that this can happen to make the claim that resource management isn't part of the game. And when you do account for this factor, HP becomes a resource too, because HP comes back usually in 10-minute increments. So if you can tax 10-minute activation abilities, you're now naturally taxing HP. And this is a pretty crucial part of making sure there's an ebb and flow between martial and caster performance. If you never tax things in a short duration, you only ever tax them on a daily basis, your spellcasters will naturally be the ones who feel most pressured, because they're the only ones running out of resources. But if melee marshals cannot guarantee that running in, taking a bunch of damage, and then healing up right after is a viable strategy, they're going to play cautiously too. They're going to adapt their tactics to account for this form of attrition. So not only is resource management a part of the game, it's actually very multidimensional. There are many different axes you can and should attrition the party along. If you overpressure any one axis, the class that suffers the most from that axis will be the one that feels bad. The game really is not expecting you to cater to the resources the party has every step of the way. Instead, it's just expecting you to build up encounters that make sense in a sequence that makes sense in, say, locations that make sense, and then whatever attrition plays out from there, plays out from there. For a wilderness survival game, this might mean 1 to 2 severe encounters spread over a few days, so you don't end up having the minute by minute or hour by hour attrition. On the other hand, in a dungeon, you probably should have the minute by minute or 10 minute by 10 minute attrition a lot of the time. And notably, I have seen a counter argument to this idea that time constraints are arbitrary and rigid. Like, why are we saying that the party only got 10 minutes to heal but didn't get 30 minutes to heal so that they got partially healed up? And I don't really understand why you would need time constraints to be this rigid. Time constraints should naturally flow from whatever story beats are in play. For example, if there is a secondary objective, the players might impose a time constraint on themselves. If they're chasing down an enemy who has, say, taken one of their friends hostage, they will just rest a little less so long as you inform them that, like, they can't just idle around as much as they'd like. Then there's uncertainty of information. If the players are not 100% sure how much time they will get in any given circumstance, they might rest less than they need to. They might even rely on consumables to pull through, say, for a little bit of healing rather than waiting for 30 minutes because they don't know they have those 30 minutes. And finally, there's agency from enemies. If you looked at the examples of time as a resource for the 1 minute and 10 minute durations that I gave, all of these just involve enemies acting in a natural way that makes sense for them. Chaining encounters together, roaming encounters that interfere with rest, or planned counterattacks that prevent the party from getting a chance to rest. All of these are natural, organic ways to tax the party's resources that go beyond just the idea that spell slots are slowly depleting over the course of a day, but nothing on the martial side ever gets touched. So I vehemently disagree with the idea that resource management isn't part of the game. In fact, why would they even give ability cooldowns like once per minute, once per 10 minutes, once per hour if resource management wasn't part of the game? At that point, you would just have ability cooldowns similar to 4th edition D&D, where it just says you can use this once per encounter because you're not expected to attrition it, right? The whole reason Pathfinder gives you these different cooldowns is to give you different dimensions to attrition the party along. Make use of them, or don't even bother catering to the party and just see how your party reacts to an organically set up adventuring day, and you will naturally see this ebb and flow and push and pull and tug of war of attrition play between daily resources, consumables, and short duration resources. The next myth is about ambushes. Notably, there are two sides to this myth. There's one category of people that argue that ambushes are bad and basically never worth doing. And then there's another category that says ambushes are mathematically unstable. You cannot allow either side, neither the party nor the NPCs, to ever perform an ambush because it makes the math fall apart. Now here is the grain of truth at the center of both of these myths. There is no codified way to reliably ambush enemies in an absolute manner. Most of what I said there should be clear. Codified simply means completely rules as written, not requiring any GM fiat. Reliably means you should be able to do this again and again. What do I mean by absolutely? Let me explain that via an example. This example comes from D&D 5th edition, and notably I'm talking about 5th edition, not 5.5e or 2024 as some of y'all call it, because the surprise condition changed in 5.5e. The way surprise used to work is if a target is surprised, they simply lose their turn. If all the targets are surprised, all of them lose their turn, which effectively means the side that performed the ambush got a whole extra turn. This is what I mean when I say absolutely ambush. When one side can perform an ambush so good that the other side nearly automatically loses, that is what I'm considering an absolute ambush here. And notably, because of Pass Without Trace, it was very easy to reliably perform this in a codified way. If your GM was just ever giving you situations where you get to move up to an enemy who is expressing less agency over this than you can ambush them pretty much all the time if you wanted. And in fact, even if enemies have some agency, you can still ambush them a good amount of the time. Because Pass Without Trace gives you a +10 to all of your party's stealth checks, which means even a pretty bad stealth modifier is gonna beat most passive perception scores in the game. Naturally, this is very cheesy and overpowered. Why? Because there's a codified way, the surprise condition, to reliably, via pass without trace, absolutely ambush enemies. It's absolute because the surprise condition is that debilitating. In Pathfinder, ambushes are just not that absolute. A lot of the time, they're a narrative tool, in that the GM needs to present circumstances for ambushes to be possible in the first place. You can't just guarantee you will sneak up on them all the time. You would need some form of cover or concealment along the way, and the requirement on it is much more stringent than in 5th edition D&D. This is why I don't consider ambushes too unstable for the game, because you're not getting all of those criteria that you have to hit for ambushes to be cheesy and broken. Now, that's where the other side comes in. People say ambushes are bad. It's too hard to perform a good ambush. Ambushes are difficult to perform. But Pathfinder does a thing where there are a lot of incremental benefits you get for attempting an ambush, even if you don't get to that absolute ambush state. First up, enemies might end up spending some prep time on their first round, even if they win initiative. If narrative circumstances are set up so that enemies are, say, seated around a campfire, or they've dropped their weapons because they're eating food, they might spend actions standing up, picking up their weapons, alerting their, say, dozed off friends, etc. And this means that they end up spending prep time in that first round. In this way, ambushes are like a pseudo fortune effect, because there's multiple dimensions along which an enemy might just end up not getting anything to do. First up, your party might just end up with a good number of you hidden or unnoticed, more on that later, which means they'll not be able to make good decisions even if they're high in initiative. Secondly, they might be high in initiative, but because of narrative circumstances, they may have to spend actions doing things like picking up weapons, like I mentioned. And thirdly, even if neither of the previous 2 points are true, they could just lose initiative to you, because you rolled stealth against their perception DC, you got detected, so you were not hidden, and there's no narrative circumstance that requires them to pick up weapons or whatever, but then they just roll low on their perception check. In this regard, being able to set up an ambush at all is kind of like having fortune on your initiative roll. Not quite as powerful as fortune, but it's definitely like a pseudo fortune effect, because you're presenting multiple ways in which an enemy could win initiative and still end up not getting good actions against you. And of course, at a baseline, rolling stealth for initiative can just be a numerical boost in itself. For many characters, their stealth might just be higher than their perception because they may have invested more into dex than in whiz, and they can freely increase the proficiency of stealth, whereas perception is on a fixed class-dependent track. And notably, even if you haven't increased your stealth all that much, if you're following the expert on somebody else who has, you get a bunch of circumstance bonuses to initiative, which one, you would need to spend a general feat on to get for initiative if you were just rolling perception, and two, they actually scale higher than those circumstance bonuses that those general feats give you. And speaking of circumstance bonuses, cover also applies to initiative. If your entire party is, say, ambushing somebody that's behind closed doors, they have greater cover from that enemy as they're getting there. This means that even on a character that has a good perception proficiency, a decent wisdom score, and something like incredible initiative boosting them, their stealth check might still end up being just as high, if not higher, than their perception check. So the raw numerical boost is also just a big reason to consider ambushes. And finally, yesterday as of recording this video, we got an errata. If you succeed on your stealth check against enemies' perception DCs, you don't start combat undetected, you start it unnoticed. Unnoticed means the enemy is completely unaware that something is even wrong. So let's say we get the ideal outcome. The entire party beats the enemy's perception DCs, all of their perception DCs. Well, the enemy doesn't get a first turn. It doesn't matter if they roll high or low in initiative. They don't get to make seek checks because they are unaware that anyone's around them. But now let's downgrade the case a little. Let's say the whole party doesn't start unnoticed, but a few of them do and a few of them don't. Well, this can still muck up the enemy. If, say, your casters started unnoticed, but your tanks didn't, well, the enemy's gonna attack the tanks and then realize they sort of chose a suboptimal target, while the optimal target, the squishy caster, was just unnoticed. And if some party members end up unnoticed to the lower perception DC enemies but not the higher perception DC ones, then the higher perception DC ones may have to spend actions pointing out those party members to the lower perception DC ones. And even if none of you start unnoticed, every single one of you fails against the lowest perception DC the enemies had on their side, even then you have the numerical bonus of rolling stealth rather than perception, which applies to a lot of characters in the game, and the pseudo fortune effect I talked about, where the enemy might just still be lower than you in initiative just because they rolled low on perception after detecting you, or even if they rolled high in initiative, they may spend 1 or 2 actions on auxiliary stuff because of the narrative circumstances that led to this ambush. And that is what makes ambushes so good in Pathfinder. They're not as absolute. A lot of things have to go right for you to be able to pull off that absolute ambush where all of you are unnoticed by all of your foes, but there are a lot of incremental ways in which some things can go right, which makes ambushing worth it on both sides of the coin. As players, if you get a narrative reason to ambush enemies, you should attempt to. They're not bad. And conversely, on the NPC side, GM should feel free to let NPCs try and ambush players if it makes in-fiction sense to attempt to do so, and not worry about the math falling apart, because these incremental steps were built so that the absolute win condition is just really, really hard to pull off. And of course, ambushes don't always have to mean stealth. I use stealth as an example because it's the most intuitive example of an ambush, but ambushes are inherently a narrative tool. If you're at a dinner party and you manage to convince anyone you were not drawing weapons with, say, good deception checks from all of the party's charisma users, and then you drew weapons and attacked the enemy, I would say they have to spend actions drawing weapons or getting up from their chairs or something like that because you were at a dinner party. So it's not all stealth. Ambushes are a narrative tool. If the GM is designing the game in any sort of a concrete, organic way rather than white room combats, opportunities for players to ambush NPCs and NPCs to ambush players are going to pop up organically. Use them, try to get those incremental benefits, and it'll make the game feel a lot more tactical because now both sides have a lot of uncertainty about how combat starts suddenly. And that makes player behavior different and NPC behavior different. So overall, in my opinion, ambushes are pretty damn good in this game and you should use them. The next myth is also one of those duality myths. It comes from 2 extremes and both surround pre-buffing. The idea that pre-buffing is this game-warping default way of playing, or that pre-buffing is game-breaking and should never be allowed. You'll notice that both dualities have the same thing in common. Ambushing and pre-buffing relate to pre-combat preparations you can take that then alter the combat tactics. And then there are sections of the community that view the flow and structure of combat tactics as being this rigid, linear thing. And then it breaks into 2 extremes. One side being the one that enjoys breaking that rigidity, that linearity, and the other that treats it as sacrosanct and something that you should never break away from. And just like with ambushes, the grain of truth is simply that pre-buffing does make the user disproportionately powerful and should be used carefully. Just like how ambushes, if you could reliably do them every single time with absolute certainty of getting the best case outcome, they'd be broken, the same is true for pre-buffing, and all you have to do is not make it that reliable and not make it that absolute. Like I said, there are extremes on both sides of this argument. Some folks argue that spells like heroism are game warping or mandatory because you always have them up. Because every combat is an enemy who waits patiently behind closed doors, so you just cast it on your friends and then open that door, right? And then others argue that because these spells are so powerful, you should ban them at your tables or just never allow pre-buffing with them. And the simple truth is, it really doesn't need to be this extreme. If and when the circumstances make sense, you should allow the player characters to pre-buff. If they don't make sense, don't allow the pre-buffing. Why are you, for example, just letting enemies stand behind closed doors and do nothing while the players are pre-buffing on the other side? Maybe the players have to make stealth checks, and if the enemies hear them, then they just open the doors and check what's up, and the players don't get a chance to pre-buff. Maybe once the first pre-buff spell is cast, the enemies hear the spell being cast. And sure, options like conceal spell or silence might change the equation here, but now that also takes a layer of investment, and enemies can still have other ways of foiling this. For example, if the players pre-buff in a dungeon and then enter a room, and the enemies realize they're outmatched, retreat to the next room, call for reinforcements, or combine with a later encounter. Go behind another set of closed doors, bar those doors and run, and wait for the party's pre-buffs to run out. There's no reason for enemies to act like video game NPCs who will never react to the player. Many of the enemies you run are going to be intelligent beings who can react to the players, and even if they're not intelligent, they might have combat instincts. Nothing gets to a reasonably high level in Pathfinder without having at least some combat instincts, not even a mindless undead. Really, the gist is, if you just keep doing it one way and it's getting stale, do the other way. Apply some combat as war mentality to it. If your players are always pre-buffing, just think of what people would do in universe to avoid constantly getting taken on by pre-buffed players. If the players are never getting a pre-buff, give them a few opportunities to pre-buff. Pre-buffing can be a really fun tool. One trick I love to pull with pre-buffing is I use over-budget encounters, like sometimes in the 200 to 240 XP range, and then just let the players pre-buff before them. This is a well beyond extreme encounter. This would be lethal to pretty much any party that's not pre-buffed, but then with the pre-buffs, they feel like they have evened the odds. And conversely, you can let NPCs pre-buff too. Just turn the tables on the players sometimes. Have the NPCs cast spells on themselves that make the players' lives harder, and you'll even make a simple moderate threat encounter much more memorable. This can be as simple as taking an enemy who has the Phantom Steed spell in their spell list and just having it cast before the players open the door. Pre-buffing is a fantastic dimension that makes the game not be repetitive all the time. This sort of goes back into myth number 2. Why are durations given in these 5-minute, 10-minute, 1-hour increments? It's because Paizo wants you to be able to play around with these durations and create different textures of the same game. The exact same encounter can play in 2 or 3 different ways, depending on, did the party get to pre-buff? Did the NPCs get to pre-buff? Did the NPCs notice the party pre-buffing and somehow react to it and interrupt their plans? And all of these will make the game more fun if you engage with it, rather than just running it as this rigid thing where it's either always on or always off. The key important thing about pre-buffing is that you want to keep things varied and fresh rather than rigidly focusing on balance, be it because you wanted to break that balance or rigidly keep it up. The next myth I wanted to talk about is the idea that single bosses of a higher level in the party are much scarier, and then equal level enemies are meh, and enemies of a lower level are pretty worthless. The grain of truth here is that this is actually just true in low level play. Between levels 1 to 2, it is true that an enemy of a lower level than you is almost always going to get one shot. They're either going to get crit right away, or they'll often die in a single hit, maximum of 2 hits. You rarely need more than 2 hits to drop a lower level enemy when you're at that low levels. And conversely, a boss that is 2 or more levels higher than you is capable of dropping you in a single crit a lot of the time, or in 1 to 3 hits. And that makes them crazy scary. And now, for better or for worse, this swinginess is intentionally designed into low-level play. I am personally not a fan of it, but it was part of the fiction Paizo wanted to tell for these levels. But as early as level 3, this starts tapering off. Maybe not right at level 3, but you can already start to see the pattern. You will slowly start seeing that groups of foes become about as deadly as single bosses that share the same XP budget. At level 1, 80 XP of boss, way deadlier than 80 XP of mooks. At level 3, 80 XP of boss might be slightly deadlier than 80 XP of mooks. By level 5, I'd say they're about equal. And then by level 9-ish, and this may vary depending on your exact party composition, I would say this reverses. The reason that groups of enemies started catching up with bosses is because, one, the groups are no longer going down in 1 to 2 hits, so they're starting to feel deadlier. And likewise, the PCs are not dropping in 1 to 2 hits, so the bosses are feeling less scary. By levels 9 plus, HP scaling generally starts outscaling the damage most Pathfinder parties can do. This means groups of foes are now much deadlier than the typical boss. Enemies will have very high uptime. They're no longer going down in 1 or 2 actions. They're often not even going down in 1 turn's worth of focus fire or 2 turns worth of focus fire. They're often taking entire rounds worth of focus fire to go down, and several blasts and control spells along the way carefully placed to enable that focus fire. Alongside this, standard enemies and mooks are now starting to showcase abilities that previously you would have only seen on a boss. Things like reactive strikes suddenly become commonplace. And sure, a reactive strike from a single lower level enemy is not that scary. 8 of them? Pretty damn scary. Now, that one exception is that bosses tend to be deadlier if they have some kind of a bullshit ability. Something like the Grim Reaper's ability to just ask for a fortitude save or you die if it crits you, or say the way that dragons have a whole bunch of spells and breath weapons and abilities and movement speeds that kind of let them run as like several enemies worth of encounter budget all on their own. That sort of bullshit can still make a single boss compelling at these high levels. I'm not saying single boss fights are worthless at high levels, but the typical single boss is now no longer deadlier than a group of enemies. A group of foes is a legitimate challenge. You need to be using spells like Wall of Stone, Synaptic Pulse, Chain Lightning, Slow 6. These are not even broken spells so much as spells parties need to have on their side to engage with the deadliness of groups of foes at these levels of play. But what does this have to do with the overall thesis of the video? I said that all of the myths I'm talking about are ultimately related to the idea that Pathfinder supports combat as war gameplay, and these myths make it look like it doesn't. What does this myth have to do with it? It's pretty clear for myths 1, 2, 3, and 4 what they had to do with combat as war gameplay. What is the relevance here? Well, the big relevance is this. When you use a whole bunch of lower level foes, it gives you as a GM a lot more agency to use tactics. When you use a single boss, you don't have that much agency. There are 4 players rolling initiative and 1 boss. There's a very high chance one of them beats the boss in initiative. If the players are now playing well, they're playing optimally, they're going to try and deny the boss actions. They'll probably take away 1 action, sometimes 2. The boss may need to do some setup on that first turn. It's very likely that on that first turn, the boss will only feel like they had 1 to 2 actions. And on future turns, they might get 3 actions, but it's not guaranteed. And having only 2-ish actions on average leaves you very little room to use tactical options like demoralizing the players or tripping them at a critical juncture, or casting a setup spell to buff yourself, or repositioning yourself. If you have something like improved grab, reactive swallow, breath weapons, etc., you might be able to pull out maximum efficiency from this, but you won't have very much agency. Once the players have pinned down what this boss's style of play is, that's all the boss is going to do, and that's all the players are going to need to fight back against, and very few bosses are exceptions to that. But when you bring a whole lot of enemies of the same XP budget as this boss to the table, suddenly you have a lot more agency. Even if the casters are able to divide and conquer your battlefield with spells like Wall of Stone and Slow 6, you still have a lot of actions left to do something useful. Using tactics as a GM forces players to start varying up their tactics. If your own side has spellcasters who throw up Walls of Stone and Walls of Force, suddenly things that seem suboptimal to the players in a vacuum are really relevant, like say feats that would let them jump over walls much more easily, or raising weapons, or spells like Disintegrate, or spells like Airlift, just a whole bunch of options. Suddenly the rogue's level 16 feat that lets them phase through walls feels like something cool and badass and combat relevant rather than just feeling like out of combat fluff. And it's not just spellcasting enemies too. Something as simple as having a group of enemies who have athletics proficiency and reactive strike, and then they just start tripping the players, and when they stand up, the players take a bunch of reactive strikes. Now the players have to react to this. Every bit of tactics you give yourself the room to use is some form of tactics you can push out of your players, and that is why this myth is important. There is this notion in the online community that if you want to challenge your players, you should use bosses. And counterintuitively, that makes the game more linear and more repetitive and more combat as sport, because a boss's gimmick can be read and turned off. And once it's turned off, it's really just a numbers game of the players winning. Even if it's challenging, it's not going to be challenging in the most engaging way. It's going to feel challenging in a bit of a bullshit way. Not saying you should never make challenges that feel bullshit for the players, but you'll make really engaging challenges if you dial back all the single bosses and start using large groups of enemies. Because once you're able to use tactics, you can coax better tactics out of your players. You can punish the repetitive rotations and tactics that they could have been using and force them to come up with novel and cool options they may not have considered before, just because you're introducing a new dimension to what tactics looks like in this game. And that brings us to our sixth and final myth, and perhaps the most important of the lot. The idea that the encounter guidelines are perfect. Why do I call this the most important myth? Well, it's because this myth sort of underpins the very tension of running the game as combat as war. The reason we say that combat as sport is the default way to run the game is because we rigidly adhere to the encounter guidelines. And the reason we do so is because of this implicit assumption that they're perfect or near perfect, and thus we shouldn't stray from them. That's why all the previous myths exist. If you think the encounter guidelines are perfect and they're designed for a full HP, full focus point party, you wouldn't let the party be below full HP and full focus points. You wouldn't attrition their resources because you would say attrition is not designed into those encounter guidelines. You wouldn't allow pre-buffing or ambushing because those tilt the math that the encounter guidelines so carefully set aside for you. And you would probably stick to single bosses because they make for some cinematic fights and they're easier to run than groups of enemies. And, well, the math is perfect, so there's no issue with this, right? But the grain of truth here is that the encounter guidelines are very, very good. Pathfinder has some of the best encounter guidelines I have ever seen. I've played other well-balanced games. I've seen other games encounter guidelines. I've played Drawsteel. I have looked at its encounter guidelines. I have looked at D&D 4th edition's guidelines. Pathfinder's guidelines are incredibly tight, but they're not perfect. And this lack of perfection is important because if you assume they're perfect, then there's no reason to deviate from them, like I said, but they're not perfect. Single bosses will always be swingier than a large number of foes. Even if the raw difficulty, the challenge tapers off, where levels 1, 2, they're just way too deadly, but then it tapers off as you level up, they're actually still swingier. That's just how law of large numbers works. When the enemy is taking 3 actions versus when the enemy is taking 12 actions because there's 4 of them, the math of the latter is much likelier to converge to an average performance than the math of the former, which is much likelier to swing towards extremes. A single boss with just 1 or 2 lucky crits or 1 or 2 unlucky crit fails from the party, it might end up taking out a player character permanently. And it swings the other way too. Sometimes the boss is just randomly way too easy because, again, swings can go both ways. So that's one way in which encounter building guidelines are not perfect. Single bosses are swingy, but that's not the only thing. Simple hazards are also swingy. At low levels, they can just one-shot you for massive damage. And I don't just mean this at level 1. I've had this happen at level 3, where a simple hazard on level for the party just instantly killed a player with no chance for death saves. And we definitely didn't have resurrection at those levels. And sure, at higher levels, your HP scaling means this is not going to happen. But high-level traps are bullshit. Have you seen some of them? Some of them just, if they crit you, you make a fortitude save, or you die. Some of them just revert you into a non-playable character if you fail or crit fail to save. So simple hazards almost entirely exist to create this swing that makes it impossible for encounter guidelines to be perfect. Simple hazards are given an XP budget, but it's a very unpredictable XP budget. You put a hazard on one tile, you run the same party through the exact same encounter twice. I guess you'd have to erase the memory of the players in between. You might have one game where they just never step on the tile and then the encounter's much easier. And in another one where they step on the tile and they just lose a player character partway through the encounter with very little way to react to it. This swing is intentionally there. It's there to make sure the guidelines are not perfect. Likewise, things like death effect, incapacitation effects, crowd control spells, when they originate on the enemy side, they drastically alter what an encounter feels like for the party. In a vacuum, it's okay to let players get close to 0 HP because you can always heal them up later, and if they do drop to 0, the only consequence is action expenditure of bringing them back up. But death effects change that equation because they just take out the player at 0 HP. Suddenly, it's really important to keep them at a high HP the whole time. Incapacitation effects can take players out up front, and that's a drastic swing to the encounter's budget because losing 1 or 2 party members is a big debuff to the party's performance. Same for any crowd control spells like Wall of Force. I have had cases where the party was facing an entirely fair encounter budget, and then a Wall of Force just separated us, and suddenly we're facing something that's double extreme for one of us, and it's really hard for us to take on. So simply having spells on the NPC side will also drastically swing the balance. NPC features and synergies can sometimes hard counter the party. For example, if you have a group of enemies that are capable of flying and making attacks from range, and your party is all melee, they're gonna have a bit of a hard time, even if they all have backup options. Like, they made the responsible decision of bringing bows, extending runes, bolas, bola shots, winged runes, winged sandals. All of the stops have been pulled out. They're still spending actions getting to the enemy. The encounter math is tilting away from the players because you chose to hard counter them. And the encounter guidelines warn you about this. They tell you that specific amounts of NPC synergy and terrain synergy sometimes can tilt the math in a way that feels much more drastic than even a threat level increase from, say, moderate to severe. Something as simple as archers on a 10-foot high ledge can be a huge challenge for a low-level party. And of course, adventure design and structure can also alter balance a lot. We talked about this when talking about resource management. There are some games where the story just naturally leads to 1 to 2 encounter days. Spells are gonna feel better in those games. And conversely, there are some stories that lead to 8, 10 encounter long days, but rarely with time constraints in the middle of those encounters. It'll be just, you have to spend the day dealing with these, but then you get unlimited rest in between them. Well, in that case, spells are going to feel weaker. And this is not a one-dimensional thing. As I talked about the resources, very small changes to the structure, the objectives, the agency, and the time constraints can have drastic impacts on the way resources are managed by the party and how they feel punished or rewarded by the GM's decisions. So the encounter guidelines are very good, but they can be tilted in a number of different ways. And this isn't a bad thing because, like I said, it liberates you to let go of the previous 5 minutes because you don't have to adhere to these so-called perfect guidelines. You just have to stay close to the very good guidelines. If the game was perfectly balanced all the time, equally so for all parties, it'd be really damn repetitive. Variance is fun. Variance is not a glitch in the game. It's not something to be scared of. It's a feature. That variance creates tension. It means your party never goes into a fight 100% knowing that they'll win. A trivial or low threat fight? Sure. Moderate fight? They're pretty sure, but some of these things can take things away. I have seen moderate fights swing all the way towards lethal just because of NPC features and hard counters and synergies, and things like death effects and simple hazards and higher level foes being swingier than lower level foes. All of these combined can create the structure where you cannot predict any one kind of encounter. The encounter guidelines do give you a pretty good estimate. An extreme threat is meant to be an even match for the party. Should you take an extreme threat encounter and give them the perfect silver bullet for the party and never telegraph to the party that that enemy has that silver bullet? Probably not, but you could do that for a moderate. It'll actually be pretty fun because now the party will go to an encounter that they thought was a foregone conclusion and suddenly have to deal with a lot of nonsense, and they'll come up with a clever new way to deal with it. So don't feel restricted by the encounter guidelines. They're there to guide you. They're there to give you an estimate, and then you deviate from them when it makes sense. If you're designing a dungeon, just expect that encounters will chain. So just don't put any severes or extremes in there, but put a lot of lows, moderates, and trivials, and just expect that some of them are going to chain and blob together to become much harder than they look. If the party have angered the wrong people, make an encounter that's over budget. Go above 160, go to 240, and then give the party some tools to tilt the math back in their favor. Maybe they get a terrain advantage in some way. Maybe they get pre-buffing. Maybe they get to ambush those enemies because they made good decisions. That's what the encounter guidelines are there for. They set out a skeletal structure for what an encounter looks like, or if you want, what an adventuring day can look like, and then you deviate from them whenever the fiction calls for it, and you deviate from them in ways that keeps these swings fresh and unpredictable so that it never gets stale. That's what this video is all about. When you want to run combat as war, it's not about running one single way all the time. It's about mixing in a variety of different things that make you deviate from the center of these guidelines without going so far that things start falling apart. The big takeaway from all of this discussion is that tactics, strategy, and synergy are not just for the players. Inherently, combat as sport assumes that the players are the ones with agency, whereas the GM has just sort of set these encounters for them to win. And some games do just explicitly support exactly that style of play. Draw Steel is a very good example of this, where the encounter building guidelines, they're pretty damn tight, and they do expect you to structure the adventuring day a certain way if you're trying to go for the higher difficulties. That's fine. Some games are not trying to support combat as war. Pathfinder, however, is. Everything we've talked about on the previous slides can be used by the GM. The GM can either directly use tactics and strategies to make the players' lives harder, like scouting for the players' weaknesses, pre-buffing, setting up ambushes, or indirectly coax tactics and strategies out of the players via external pressures like time constraints, attrition, secondary objectives, etc. One of the biggest consequences of this is that trivial and low-threat encounters no longer need to be filler. This is a relatively common complaint, not the most common one, but I've seen plenty of people say that low-threat encounters are just kind of filler. Some people say it's fun to have this filler because it's fun to feel powerful, and others say it's unengaging, boring, and tedious to have this filler. But ultimately, does it need to be filler? Let me give an example from a recent dungeon I was running. The players got to room 1 of a dungeon. They fought against a low-threat encounter. They captured one of the enemies in that low-threat encounter, a pretty important NPC, and decided, okay, we need to retreat and take this enemy back to prison in our hometown. Rooms 2 and 3 of the dungeon. There are still people in there. When they were going about their day-to-day, they realized that room 1 had been raided. They spent some time investigating what the players had done to raid this room, where they'd come back from, and set up an ambush. First, there were mimics set up in the room the players would come in from. The players happened to fail their perception checks to spot these mimics. This is not just the GM saying rocks fall, everyone dies. I gave the players perception checks, they failed. They went past the mimics, engaged in combat with those remaining cultists in another room, and then the mimics activated behind them and ran to their flank. And now, the frontliners, the tanky melees, were engaged with the cultists. The Mimic's goal was just to swallow a squishy spellcaster and run away with them, prevent the melees from now receiving any aid they would from the backline, and hopefully let the melees get overwhelmed by what is now an unfair fight for them. This is all I mean when I say combat as war gameplay. I took what would have been trivial and low-threat encounters, filler, and just made them act and react in ways that made them engaging and memorable. Repeat this a few times across a few different sessions, and you have a whole adventure run in this way that's going to be full of memorable combats. You'll probably have plenty of straightforwardly run combats, but the important thing is that a lot of the time you're going to be thinking about the fiction. what would the NPCs and monsters do if they were real, so to speak. Now remember, you should not just blob the encounters up into an impossible to win combat right away. That's just unfun. And like I said right at the beginning, that goes against the spirit of combat as war, because combat as war is not about just putting an impossible challenge in front of the players and then killing them. It's about setting up many avenues and many paths and seeing how the players navigate it as best as they can while trying to minimize risk as best as they can. Personally, I like to challenge players incrementally. For example, if we're trying to plot out a huge dungeon and the players slowly start raising alarms, they've set off some traps, they have been spotted by some enemies, got into combat, and some of those enemies ran away. It's not like the entire dungeon is now going to descend on them and immediately slaughter them or immediately drive them out, but instead, what would have, say, been trivial, low becomes trivial, low, moderate as encounters start blobbing up. And then if the players are still not careful, it might become moderate, severe. And then if they're still not careful, it might just become extremes and maybe things over extreme. There's no reason to stick to fair budgets as long as you're increasing the challenge incrementally. If your players make enough poor decisions, then they should get to the impossible to win combat. Of course they should. But that's the key. You have to be rewarding good decisions and punishing bad ones incrementally so that it builds up to the thing that they then can't win. Having several competing secondary objectives is a great way to help with this, because the sheer uncertainty this creates will make players sort of play in a combat as war way, even if you are not putting that much pressure on them. And make sure there's some kind of a worst case outcome. In that dungeon I just spoke about, the worst case outcome is all of the encounters blob up together. This is not necessarily death. The players are not stupid. If they fought 4 goblins earlier and that felt like a low threat encounter and now they're seeing 60 goblins, they know they can't win that. They'll just retreat. But retreat might have a cost. Maybe the goblin camp they're attacking is now free to perform another raid on their allies' city. Maybe those allies are less happy with the players. Maybe quest rewards get worse because of this. You can still have death as the worst case outcome for enough poor decisions, like, say, charging into that 68 goblin encounter, but it doesn't have to be the one and only worst case outcome. And subsystems tend to be a really good way of bridging the gaps because they can help you deal with what might be mathematically impossible for the players, but just structurally have a narrative where the players can still get through it. For example, if the players are in a sandbox environment, you shouldn't really be allotting enemies to the players' levels. Enemies should be based on their own levels. If there is a level 13 adult dragon living in that swamp, there's a level 13 dragon in that swamp. And if the players start mistakenly heading in there, telegraph it to them. Talk about how they're not seeing any wildlife. Give them one hard encounter that was running away from that dragon that these players barely managed to beat. And then if they still get to the dragon, maybe run a chase or a negotiation subsystem of some kind. And if all of that fails, then give them the worst case outcome of the dragon just killing them, because now they have made enough poor decisions. You have plenty of tools available for this. You can pressure players' resources and time, especially with secondary objectives and, say, geographical constraints. You can ambush them, just pretty directly ambush them and make things harder than the XP budget would suggest. Even if you don't get a full ambush, even a simple terrain advantage can do this. Areas of difficult terrain, areas of high ground, areas with hazards and hazardous terrain along the way. All of these can help your NPCs engage with the players in what would be easily winnable for the players on paper and still be interesting and engaging. Use synergies and unique tactics against them. Don't be scared to actually play a little smart against your players. You don't have to just stand in a circle and beat on the melee tank. Go dive that spellcaster in the backline. See how your players react to that. And finally, consider just directly countering their typical tactics. If they always do a certain thing with flying, see how they react when enemies with their own flying speeds attack them. If they always rely on invisibility, see what happens when enemies with unique senses that bypass that invisibility attack them. Hell, sometimes a simple retreat can be a great way to counter player tactics. If the players pre-buff, have the NPCs retreat, and those pre-buffs wear off, and now the NPCs can counterattack without giving the players prep time. So you have a lot of tools. I gave a few examples earlier, and every single one of those examples is based on something I have actually run at the table. The gist is combat as war works in Pathfinder if you know how to use these tools right, and if you let go of all of the myths from before, especially the one about encounter guidelines being perfect and rigidly adhered to. Now, some of you might be coming away from this video still not knowing when or why you should apply these combat as war principles. Even if you think these ideas are neat, how do you know if your party needs it? How do you know it'll actually make gameplay better for your players if, say, you're a GM, or for the rest of your party and you if, say, you're a player and want to talk to your GM about this? So let's talk about that a little bit before we wrap up this video. Firstly, as I said before, if you just genuinely enjoy combat as sport, you don't need to change a thing. If your GM is on board, if all the players are on board, and you're all having fun with encounters mostly existing in a vacuum, mostly being fair towards the players, and often not caring about attrition and other such inter-encounter dependencies beyond, say, spell slots, and you enjoy this, then that's perfectly fine. And conversely, many of you might be unconsciously, without even realizing it, be doing a lot of the things we talked about in this video. Maybe this video will inspire some new ideas for you, but other than that, you don't really need to change your overall playstyle. But there are many folks who are playing in this combat as sport way and have complaints about it, and perhaps are not using the verbiage of combat as sport versus combat as war, even though the problems do stem from that. So the complaint is not always going to be obvious, and here are a few examples of complaints somebody might have that you can solve by going in a more combat as war direction. One of the most common ones is the idea that optimal playstyles get repetitive. The most common example of such an optimized playstyle being spellcasters focusing on action denial and cheerleading, and then marshals focusing on ganging up on the enemies in melee and setting up for a chain of reactions like reactive strike, opportune backstab, etc. If at your table you start feeling like this playstyle gets repetitive, reacting to the players in a more combat as war way can really help change things. You'll be coaxing out different tactics from them, especially if you start countering some of their options. Use large numbers of foes. Use spellcasters who can turn off enemy reactions if they go high up enough in initiative. Use spells like Slow 6 against your party. Have enemies with auras or reactions of their own that makes ganging up and staying next to them too dangerous a consequence. Have enemies try to ambush players and catch them off position so they can't always get into the perfect backline, frontline division of a formation. All of these can really help to alleviate that problem. Another one is something we already talked about. If you find that trivial and low encounters often feel like filler, and some tables even feel like moderate encounters feel like filler, simply using combat as war tactics, living in the fiction of how these low threat encounters would still coordinate and work together to make the player's life difficult, using secondary objectives, every single one of these principles can really help alleviate that problem. Having a secondary objective at the end of a chain of encounters, even something as simple as a hostage that needs rescuing, can make people start spending resources on, say, a trivial or low threat encounter, and then suddenly it doesn't feel like filler anymore. Another common complaint, and this one is very common for Paizo Adventure Paths, is suspension of disbelief getting stretched a little too far when you're in cramped, dungeon-like environments. Now, that's not a dig at Adventure Paths. Adventure Paths, by their very nature, need to be built for the average party to clear. But if you find that at your table, your party's finding this repetitive and it's breaking your suspension of disbelief and it's monotonous, then simply play the enemies in these environments in realistic ways. Have scenarios where later encounters hear the earlier encounters and react to them. Reinforce them perhaps, or retreat and toughen up their own encounters, or set up ambushes for players, or interrupt their rests. Many such combinations of options can make the game better for your table if this is a problem you have. Next up, the complaint that difficult fights feel less active and engaging and more about just manipulating numbers. This complaint is most commonly used against single boss fights, because when the GM side does not have that much agency, they really are only going to do one or two different kinds of things. And as the players, all you really have to do is pump your numbers to make sure you're reliable against the boss, and then try and figure out a way to stop the boss from doing the thing they want to do. So applying a combat as war mentality, specifically with using a larger number of foes, can really help with this problem, and using tactics and synergies on the side of the GM can really help make fights feel more active. If the players are not engaging in certain tactics, but the GM side is, the players are now going to be forced to do so as well. Then there's the idea that combat might not feel cinematic at your tables. And this complaint might feel out of place to some of you, because you might wonder, what does cinematic gameplay have to do with the mechanics of combat as war? And I would say it has everything to do with the mechanics, because if you're not engaging in combat as war gameplay, you might find that over time, your party is just sort of doing the same thing every combat, sort of standing in roughly the same positions every combat. And if you're not incorporating, for example, the environment, various tactics that you can use with the environment and stuff like ambushes, then every fight might start feeling more and more similar. But when the enemies engage in a more combat as war way, where they consider things like retreating out of combat, perhaps backing out into a different room and poking in with range attacks and spells from in there, now you can create a dynamic moving battlefield that, when the players engage with, is going to give a lot to the imagination for cinematic and tactical gameplay. And finally, there's the complaint that NPCs feel like they have to play dumb for you to win. This is often a complaint for enemies that have these unique synergies, like, for example, a flying enemy with something like a breath weapon or a powerful range attack, or a burrowing enemy with Swallow Whole. And sometimes this even just comes down to spellcasting. There are a lot of spells that are viewed as not okay for the GM to cast on the players. But I would recommend go ahead and do it. I would recommend just let these things feel as deadly as they should, especially if the idea that NPCs are playing dumb for your party to win is messing with the fun for you. Some things should be hard to engage with for the party. Locking down an incorporeal creature who can flee through however many feet of concrete is supposed to be difficult in fiction. Fighting a flying enemy is supposed to be difficult if you engage them out in the open. Burrowing enemies who swallow you are supposed to be really hard to take on. And if you just stop your NPCs from playing dumb and engage with the abilities they have, you will then coax the players into playing more cautiously, playing more tactically, and varying up their plans. They wouldn't just stand in a circle around the boss and start using reaction spam on them, for example, if they suspected that Swallow Whole plus Burrow Down was a real possibility they had to contend with. They would need backup options and backup weapons and backup plans for how to deal with what's coming up for them. So if you're playing or GMing at any of the tables where you hear this complaint, then this video was for you. The root cause of the complaint is still running the game more in a combat as sport way instead of in a combat as war way. If you have none of these complaints, you just enjoy the combat as sport playstyle. But if you or others at your table are having these problems, then this is one way to try and go about solving them. That is all for today's video, folks. I hope I've convinced you that these things I call myths really are myths. They're not embedded in the game's assumptions. It's fine for you to just play close to the game's baseline, but the game doesn't fall apart when you deviate from it, and in fact, the game encourages you to deviate from it and wants you to deviate from it. It'll make the game more varied and fun, provided that you want it to be varied and fun in that way. And I hope that the overarching point of combat as war gameplay and how it relates to all of these myths that are embedded into our perception of Pathfinder, I hope that overall point makes sense. I hope some of y'all who may have shied away from some of these combat as war principles feel encouraged to go for it in Pathfinder. It is a lot of fun to engage with, and the game really wants you to kind of push at its limits, because the encounter building guidelines are very good and very flexible. And I think people give a lot of credit for them being good, but not enough for how flexible they really are. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you can, please join a channel membership. It is a small fee to directly support me and benefit from a few perks, like early releases of videos and written build guides. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Mathfinder out.